night shift. Jake had always prided himself on being the dependable one. In his years working as a night security guard, nothing rattled him. Not the creaks of settling buildings, not the distant echoes of the city streets, and certainly not the long hours of solitude. But the new job at the abandoned St. Mary's Hospital was different. The hospital had been closed for decades, its patients long since relocated after a string of mysterious deaths that had brought the place to infamy. The building was a crumbling relic, left to rot and be forgotten by time. Yet, the hospital's eerie reputation didn't deter Jake. A job was a job, and he needed the money. The first few nights had been uneventful, though the place did have an unsettling atmosphere. The hallways seemed to stretch forever, the peeling paint and crumbling ceilings adding to the sense of decay. Jake would walk the floors, his flashlight beam bouncing off walls that hadn't seen light in years. Occasionally he'd hear a distant clang or the scuttle of rats, but nothing out of the ordinary. On the fourth night, things started to change. It began with the elevator. Jake had been making his rounds when he heard the sound of grinding gears, a mechanical whirring that reverberated through the empty halls. The elevator, long out of service, had somehow come to life. The doors creaked open on the second floor, releasing a blast of stale air that smelled of rust and decay. Curiosity got the better of him. Jake approached cautiously, peering into the elevator car. It was empty, of course, but the buttons inside were flickering as if someone had been pressing them. He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside and hitting the button for the basement. He knew it was a mistake the moment the doors closed. The descent was agonizingly slow, the elevator shuddering as it went deeper into the bowels of the hospital. The dim light inside flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. When the doors finally opened, Jake was met with pitch darkness. He stepped out into the basement, feeling his way along the damp walls. His flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, revealing glimpses of rusted pipes and broken tiles. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, with a strange metallic odor that made him gag. As he ventured further, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like the heartbeat of the building itself. It was coming from deeper within the basement, from a place the light couldn't reach. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but something compelled him forward, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't resist. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a heartbeat, but the sound of breathing. Shallow, labored, and not his own. Jake's pulse quickened as he realized he wasn't alone. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, it caught something in the beam. A figure at the far end of the corridor. It was hunched over, its back to him, but he could see the ragged rise and fall of its shoulders as it breathed. The figure was wrapped in a tattered hospital gown, its bare feet standing in a pool of dark liquid that spread across the floor. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. He took a step closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure remained still, its breathing slow and steady. Another step, and Jake could see the outline of its head, the matted hair that clung to its scalp. And then the figure began to turn. Jake froze as it turned to face him, its movements slow and deliberate. When he saw its face, he nearly dropped the flashlight. The figure wasn't human. Not anymore. Its eyes were hollow sockets, dark and empty, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The skin was taut, stretched over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Jake staggered back, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the oppressive atmosphere. But the figure took a step toward him, dragging its feet through the viscous liquid on the floor. It reached out with one skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted. Jake turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted down the corridor. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with his frantic retreat. He didn't dare look back. His only thought was to get away. He reached the elevator and slammed the button repeatedly, praying for the doors to open. When they finally did, he threw himself inside and hit the button for the first floor. The doors closed just as the figure reached the threshold, its hand outstretched as if to grab him. The ride back up was torturous. The final call. Mia was used to late-night calls, Working as a 911 dispatcher, she had heard it all. Panicked voices, whispered cries for help, and even prank calls. But there was something about the stillness of the night that made everything more intense. The darkness amplified the fear in people's voices, and it was her job to keep them calm, to guide them through their worst moments. It was nearing 3 a.m., the witching hour, as some of her coworkers like to call it. The office was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of papers. Maya sipped her coffee, trying to shake off the wariness that clung to her like a shroud. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. The screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown number. She took a deep breath and answered, her voice steady and professional. 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Mia strained to hear, her senses heightened. Then a faint voice came through, barely more than a whisper. Help me. Mia leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was that of a woman, trembling with fear. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm, Mia said, her fingers hovering over the keyboard ready to dispatch help. Can you tell me where you are? I don't know, the woman replied, her voice quivering. It's so dark. I'm so scared. Are you inside or outside? Inside, it's cold. I'm alone. Mia's mind raced. She needed more information. Can you see anything around you? Any windows, doors, furniture? There was a pause. Then the woman spoke again, her voice barely audible. It's just empty. Nothing but darkness. Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She had dealt with disoriented callers before, but this was different. There was something in the woman's voice that set her on edge, a sense of hopelessness that was almost palpable. Do you remember how you got there? Mia asked, trying to piece together the situation. No, I just woke up here. The woman's voice cracked with emotion. I don't know where I am. Please help me. Mia's fingers flew over the keyboard as she tried to trace the call. But the screen showed nothing. No location, no information. It was as if the call wasn't coming from anywhere. Ma'am, can you tell me your name? Mia asked, her voice soft, hoping to keep the woman talking. There was a long pause, and when the woman spoke again, her voice was laced with confusion. My name? I don't remember. Mia's concern deepened. It's okay. We're going to figure this out. Just stay with me, okay? Suddenly, there was a noise on the line, a low, guttural sound that made Mia's blood run cold. It was followed by a faint scraping, like something heavy being dragged across a rough surface. Do you hear that? The woman whispered, her fear almost tangible, through the phone. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. Yes, I hear it. Do you know what it is? No, but it's getting closer. Mia could hear the woman's breath quicken, her fear escalating. The scraping sound grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was making it was approaching the woman. Ma'am, you need to find a place to hide, Mia urged, her voice rising with urgency. Can you move? Can you find a door or something to block it? I can't see anything. The woman's voice was shaky, on the verge of hysteria. It's so close now. Please, don't let it get me. Mia's mind raced, her heart pounding as she tried to think of something, anything that could help. But the sound on the other end was becoming unbearable, a relentless scraping that was now accompanied by a deep, rumbling growl. Ma'am, listen to me, Mia said, her voice firm despite the fear creeping up her spine. You need to run. Run as fast as you can. There was a sudden burst of static, and then the woman screamed, a blood-curdling scream that sent chills down Mia's spine. The line went dead, leaving Mia staring at the phone in shock. She frantically tried to reconnect the call, her hands trembling. But no matter how many times she dialed, there was nothing but an endless tone. The call was gone, as if it had never existed. Mia sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. Had it been real? A nightmare? She looked at the call log, but there was no trace of the call, no record that it had ever come through. Her hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup, needing something to ground herself. But as she lifted it to her lips, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The coffee was ice cold. It was as if hours had passed since she last touched it, even though it had only been minutes. Mia looked around the office, suddenly feeling like she wasn't alone. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier, and the air colder than it should be. She glanced at the clock on the wall, and her heart skipped a beat. The clock was frozen. The hands stuck at 3 a.m., the exact moment the call had come through. A cold dread settled over her as she realized the implications. Something had happened during that call, something that had bent time, twisted reality. The woman's voice echoed in her mind, the terror in it so real, so raw. And then, as if on cue, her phone rang again. Mia stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. The same unknown number flashed on the screen, the sound of the ring cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Her hand hovered over the receiver, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. The phone rang and rang, each chime louder and more insistent, until it abruptly stopped. Mia let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced at the call log again, but it was blank. No record of the incoming call, no trace of the terror she had just experienced. She was about to call for her supervisor when the lights in the office flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a split second before the emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. And then, in the oppressive silence, she heard it. The same low guttural sound from the call, the scraping of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Mia's blood turned to ice as she realized the sound was coming from right outside the dispatch room door. The final call hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The sound in the walls. Dan and Emily were ecstatic when they found the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was a bit run down, sure, but that only added to its charm. The price was a steal, and they couldn't resist the idea of restoring the grand old place to its former glory. They moved in with dreams of making it their forever home, excited about the journey ahead. The first few weeks were consumed with renovations. Every creak and groan of the house felt like it was coming back to life, and they spent their days peeling wallpaper, sanding floors, and painting walls. It was hard work, but they were happy, surrounded by the scent of fresh paint and sawdust. But it wasn't long before they began to notice something strange. At first, it was just small things. Tools misplaced, lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves. They brushed it off, attributing it to the quirks of an old house. But then the noises started. It began with a soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on the walls. It would come at odd hours, usually late at night, just as they were drifting off to sleep. Dan and Emily would lie in bed, listening as the tapping moved from room to room, as if someone were walking through the house, knocking gently on the walls as they went. One night, Dan had had enough. He got out of bed, determined to find the source of the noise. Armed with a flashlight, he wandered through the dark house, following the sound. But no matter where he went, the tapping seemed to always be one step ahead, moving through the walls, just out of reach. "I don't get it," Dan said, frustrated, as he returned to bed. "It's like the noise is inside the walls." Emily shivered, pulling the covers up to her chin. "It's probably just the house settling," she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. But as the nights went on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It no longer stopped at the walls. It began to come from the ceiling, the floor, even the furniture. It was as if the house itself were alive, and it was trying to tell them something. Then came the whispers. Dan was the first to hear them. He was in the basement, working on the plumbing, when he heard a faint voice calling his name. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, but when he called out to Emily, there was no response. He brushed it off as his imagination, but the voice stayed with him, a soft, persistent murmur that seemed to follow him through the house. Emily heard the whispers too, but hers came at night, in the moments just before she fell asleep. They were soft, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakably real. She would lie there, wide-eyed in the darkness, listening as the voices whispered her name over and over until sleep finally claimed her. The whispers soon became too much to ignore. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Dan and Emily finally admitted to each other what they had been hearing. The relief of sharing their experiences quickly gave way to dread as they realized the whispers were not just random noises. They were deliberate, purposeful, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with them. "We need to figure out what's going on," Dan said, his voice tight with resolve. "Maybe there's something in the walls, or, I don't know, something we missed." They began to search the house in earnest, tapping on walls, checking for hidden doors or compartments, anything that might explain the noises. But the house remained stubbornly silent during the day, revealing nothing. Then one night, the tapping stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it was almost more unsettling than the noise. Dan and Emily lay in bed, holding their breath, waiting for the next sound. But it didn't come. Just as they began to relax, thinking perhaps the ordeal was finally over, they heard it, a low, scraping sound coming from beneath the floorboards. It was slow, methodical, as if something was being dragged across the floor. Dan jumped out of bed, his heart racing. "Stay here," he whispered to Emily, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. He crept downstairs, following the sound to the living room. The scraping was louder now, coming from directly beneath the floor. Dan knelt down, pressing his ear to the hardwood. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving beneath the floorboards. With trembling hands, Dan pried up a loose floorboard, shining his flashlight into the dark space below. At first, he saw nothing but dust and cobwebs, but then the beam of light caught something small and metallic, glinting in the darkness. Dan reached down, his fingers brushing against cold metal. He pulled the object out, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what it was. A key, old and rusted, with a thick layer of grime covering it. But there was something else, too. A piece of fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a nail beneath the floor. Dan's heart pounded as he examined the fabric. It was old, frayed around the edges, but unmistakably part of a dress that had been buried beneath the floorboards for who knows how long. "What is it?" Emily's voice came from behind him, making him jump. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Dan held up the key and the fabric. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out." The key didn't fit any of the locks in the house. It wasn't until they returned to the basement that they noticed something they had overlooked before. A small, hidden door behind the boiler, barely visible in the shadows. The key fit perfectly. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase, leading down into the darkness. Dan and Emily exchanged a glance, their fear palpable, but they knew they had to see this through. The stairs led to a small, stone-walled room, barely larger than a closet. The air was thick and musty, and the walls were damp with age. In the center of the room was a small wooden chest, covered in dust and cobwebs. Dan's hands shook as he opened the chest. Inside, he found more pieces of the dress, old photographs, and letters, all yellowed with age. The photos were of a young woman, smiling brightly, her face full of life. But the letters told a different story, of a woman who had gone missing from the house decades ago, her body never found. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, filling the small room with their desperate pleas. Dan and Emily backed away, their eyes wide with terror as the temperature in the room plummeted. And then they saw her, a faint, ghostly figure standing in the corner, her eyes hollow and dark, her once beautiful face twisted in sorrow. She reached out to them, her voice a whisper on the cold air. "Help me." Dan and Emily ran, the ghost's cries echoing in their ears as they fled up the stairs, slamming the door behind them. The whispers followed them, filling the house with their mournful wails. The tapping returned, louder and more frantic than ever, as if the house itself was begging for release. They didn't sleep that night. They packed their bags and left the house before dawn, abandoning their dream of restoration, leaving the ghosts of the past to their haunted home. As they drove away, the house stood silent and dark, watching them go. But inside, the whispers continued, trapped forever within the walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting occupants to hear their desperate plea. "Help me." The hollow mirror. Anna had always loved antique stores. There was something magical about walking through aisles filled with objects from the past, each one holding a story of its own. It was on one of these visits that she found the mirror. It was tucked away in a corner of the shop, almost hidden among a pile of old furniture. The mirror was tall and ornate, with a heavy, dark wood frame intricately carved with patterns that looked like twisting vines. The glass itself was slightly clouded with age, but there was a certain allure to it that Anna couldn't resist. "How much for the mirror?" she asked the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He glanced at the mirror, his expression unreadable. "That old thing? I'll give it to you for $50. Anna didn't hesitate. She paid the man and arranged for the mirror to be delivered to her apartment the next day. She was thrilled with her find, already imagining where she would hang it. When the mirror arrived, Anna decided to place it in her bedroom. It was heavy, and she had to call her friend Mark to help her move it. Together, they hung it on the wall opposite her bed, where it would catch the light from the window. "That's a seriously creepy mirror," Mark remarked as they stepped back to admire their work. "I mean, it's cool and all, but doesn't it give you the chills?" Anna laughed, dismissing his concerns. "It's just old, that's all. Besides, it gives the room character." Mark shrugged, not entirely convinced, but he didn't push the matter further. That night, Anna lay in bed, staring at the mirror. It was the first thing she noticed when she woke up in the middle of the night, a soft beam of moonlight reflecting off its surface. It seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, almost as if it had a light of its own. She felt a strange unease, but chalked it up to her overactive imagination. After all, it was just a mirror. The first few nights passed without incident. Anna quickly grew used to the mirror's presence, and any lingering discomfort faded away. But then, the strange occurrences began. It started subtly, a glimpse of movement in the mirror that wasn't there when she looked directly at it. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but as the days went on, the occurrences became more frequent. One night, as she was brushing her hair before bed, Anna saw something in the mirror that made her freeze. For just a split second, she could have sworn she saw someone standing behind her, a dark figure, tall and shadowy, with no distinguishable features. She spun around, but her bedroom was empty. Her heart pounded as she turned back to the mirror, but there was nothing there. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light, but the unease she had felt that first night returned, stronger than before. The next morning, she called Mark. "Hey, have you ever had a feeling like you're being watched?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Not really," Mark replied. "Why? What's going on?" Anna hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "It's probably nothing, but I've been seeing weird things in the mirror, like shadows or movements that aren't there." Mark was silent for a moment. "You sure it's not just your reflection? Maybe you're tired." "Maybe," Anna said, though she didn't believe it herself. Mark offered to come over and check it out, but Anna declined. She didn't want to seem paranoid, and besides, she had lived in the apartment for years without any issues. It was just a mirror. How bad could it be? But the incidents only got worse. Anna began to have nightmares, vivid and terrifying. In them, she was trapped in her bedroom, unable to move, while something watched her from the mirror. She could feel its gaze on her, cold and unyielding, as it slowly drew closer. Each time, she would wake up drenched in sweat, the mirror the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes. One night, she woke up to the sound of whispering. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the mirror. Anna sat up in bed, straining to hear. But the whispers seemed to fade as soon as she tried to focus on them. Her eyes flicked to the mirror, and her breath caught in her throat. There, in the glass, was her reflection. But it wasn't right. The figure in the mirror was standing up, while Anna was still sitting in bed. The reflection stared back at her with eyes that were not her own, dark, empty, and full of malice. Panic surged through her. She blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by her normal reflection. But the unease remained, gnawing at her, refusing to be dismissed. The next day, Anna decided to cover the mirror. She threw a sheet over it, determined to block out whatever strange influence it had over her. For the first time in days, she felt a small sense of relief. That night, she slept without nightmares. The room was quiet, the atmosphere lighter without the mirror watching her. But just as she was beginning to relax, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of the sheet sliding off the mirror. Her eyes snapped open, and she bolted upright in bed. The sheet lay crumpled on the floor, and the mirror stood uncovered, its surface reflecting the moonlight with an eerie glow. Anna's heart raced as she stared at the mirror, dreading what she might see. But the glass was empty. No strange reflections, no shadowy figures. Just her own terrified face staring back at her. She couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, she called Mark and asked him to come over. "We need to get rid of the mirror," she told him as soon as he arrived. "I don't care what you say, there's something wrong with it." Mark didn't argue. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he knew she was serious. Together, they took the mirror down from the wall and carried it out to the garage. Anna wanted to smash it, to be done with it for good, but Mark convinced her to sell it back to the antique store instead. It's probably worth something, he reasoned. No point in destroying it. Anna reluctantly agreed, though the thought of someone else buying the mirror filled her with dread. They loaded the mirror into Mark's truck and drove back to the antique store. The shopkeeper was there, the same old man who had sold it to her in the first place. "Changed your mind?" he asked, eyeing the mirror. "Yeah," Anna said, her voice shaky. I just don't want it anymore." The shopkeeper nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand. Not everyone is meant to keep it." Anna frowned, puzzled by his words. "What do you mean?" The old man held a small knowing smile. "This mirror has a way of choosing its owners. Some people can handle what it shows them, others not so much." Anna felt a chill run down her spine. "What does it show?" The shopkeeper's smile faded. "Truth," he said simply. "But not the truth you see every day. It shows the truth hidden in the darkness, the truth you keep buried deep inside." Anna didn't know what to say. She just wanted to be rid of the mirror, to forget about the nightmares and the whispers. Mark exchanged the mirror for some cash, and they left the shop in silence. As they drove away, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that she had escaped something terrible, something far worse than she had ever imagined. But the relief was short-lived. That night, as she lay in bed, Anna couldn't help but think about the mirror. She tried to push it out of her mind, to focus on the fact that it was gone, but the unease wouldn't leave her. Then, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard it, a soft, familiar whisper. Her eyes flew open, and she gasped in horror. There, on the wall opposite her bed, was the mirror. The same ornate frame, the same clouded glass. It was as if it had never left. Anna's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stared at the mirror, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She knew it was impossible, that the mirror couldn't be there. But there it was, glowing faintly in the darkness. And in the glass she saw her reflection, but it wasn't alone. Behind her, just over her shoulder, was the dark figure she had seen before, its eyes hollow and empty. It leaned closer, its mouth opening in a silent scream, and Anna finally understood the truth the shopkeeper had spoken of. The mirror had chosen her. As the figure in the glass reached out for her, Anna's screams filled the room, echoing off the walls. But there was no one to hear her, no one to save her. The next morning, when Mark arrived to check on her, he found the apartment empty. The bed was unmade, the front door unlocked, but there was no sign of Anna. The only thing left behind was the mirror, hanging on the wall, its glass smooth and unbroken. Mark stared at it for a long time, feeling a chill settle over him. The mirror's surface was clear, reflecting only his own pale face, but as he turned to leave, he thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye.